Today we can identify the 1980s as a uniquely distinct period of modern history which, especially if you lived through them, feels very different in the memory when compared to the 1960s or the 1970s. In Great Britain, a seismic shift in social and political reality marked a change so profound that it actually affected the entire world. For Harley-Davidson, looking in from the outside, there appeared to be little or no difference in the 1980s motor company compared to the 1970s. AMF was still firmly at the helm in 1980, and the company was still producing ironhead Sportsters and shovelhead Cruisers and Tourers. Granted, the terrible quality control problems were finally being sorted out, but otherwise it was very much more of the same for the motorcycles. But the seismic shift that began in Great Britain quickly spread to North America, where it positively impacted Harley-Davidson in the short term. In the medium and long terms, these are the years where the foundations of the modern Harley-Davidson Motor Company were laid. The apparent lack of change was merely a convincing veneer. In physics, there's a phenomenon called potential energy. It means that if you lift a half-ton Harley-Davidson and place it on a shelf above your head, potential energy stored is monstrous, even though it appears that nothing's happening. Although most of that energy was being generated by the parent company, AMF, it was the legendary Vaughan Beals who was going to release it all in one explosive earthquake which would reverberate through Harley-Davidson for 5 solid years. We merely need to note that the previously mentioned seismic shift in social and political reality was first set in motion by one single individual, Margaret Thatcher. Mrs. Thatcher became Britain's first female Prime Minister in May 1979, winning an even larger majority for the Conservatives. The Chronicle of the 20th Century records that Mrs. Thatcher said, "I feel an aura of calm after her victory." With hindsight, I think that she was the only one in Great Britain who felt like that. The 39th President of the United States of America, Jimmy Carter, faced many of the same problems in 1980 as the British Premier did: high unemployment, high inflation and economic recession. The Shah of Iran left for exile in February 1980. Ruhollah Khomeini effectively replaced the Shah. This led markets around the world to panic and oil prices rose massively, leading to rationing in many countries, including America. On the 4th of November 1979, Iranian students took over the US Embassy in Tehran, taking 52 diplomats as hostages. On April 24, 1980, President Carter ordered military intervention, but the mission was a disaster. 8 servicemen died and 2 aircraft were destroyed. Unfortunately for President Carter, 1980 was an election year, so his presidency was doomed. On top of all this, for Harley-Davidson, was the whole issue of potential energy. Whether the motor company liked it or not, AMF was starting to raise Harley higher and higher up the wall towards that aforementioned high shelf. In February 1978, after 10 years at the helm of American Machine and Foundry, Rodney Gott resigned as chief executive, and the board elected W. Tom York to replace him. Gott was a Harley fan who had been very supportive to the motor company as AMF boss, but York was, according to Vaughan Beals, a bean counter. The problem with bean counters is that they focus on numbers exclusively because they believe the fallacy that numbers don't lie. It takes a rather more visionary approach to life to understand that the best number does not always equal success, and therefore fulfillment must be attainable apart from success. This understanding also takes intelligent compassion. My YouTube channel has never earned me one single penny. Many people have told me that my YouTubing is a waste of time. Indeed, YouTube are, without doubt, the most numerically focused company I have ever dealt with in my 60-plus years on Earth, and their vast and complex analytics features seem to fully support the "you've got no hope" point of view. Here, it's financially pointless. There are too few beans being generated, so I should just stop doing it. Usually the beans counted equate to money, but money is not the only bean. Politicians also count beans. In Series 1 of the glorious turn-of-the-century TV show The West Wing, Episode 16 is entitled 20 Hours in LA. Written by the incomparable Aaron Sorkin, the character Al Kiefer, played by John Delancey, says to Martin Sheen's President Bartlett, "I got numbers, and I know numbers, and I trust numbers. This is not theoretical." These beans are numbers of votes as expressed in percentages of the total available. Bankers obviously count money as beans, as do most in business management. Sports franchises count beans as win rates for players and teams. The problem here is that beans become much more important than anything else, to the point that literally nothing else matters. Unfortunately, this is generally accepted by us, the public, because we have somehow become browbeaten into accepting the lie that the end justifies the means. Winning is what counts, and the one with the most beans is always the winner. Big company chief executives tend to be bean counters. It's accepted because these companies usually have vast numbers of shareholders whose own beans represent the financial income earned from the shares they own. Thus, everyone in Bean World is happy. The Chief Executive Officer of Harley-Davidson since early 2020 has been Jochen Zeitz, who might be regarded as a genius CEO. His previous post was at Puma, where he was CEO for 13 years. During that time, Puma's share price gained around 4,000%, from €8.60 to €350. Recruiting Zeitz was obviously an incredible coup for Harley-Davidson. Certainly the numbers say so. But has Mr. Zeitz's inner bean counter been released? For the Harley-Davidson Sportster XL, it seems so. Within a few short months of taking up the helm, Zeitz must have identified numbers showing that the Sportster was redundant. So he ended production. Even if Mr. Zeitz is a genius CEO, surely that decision must have been the result of bean counting, not genius. When Tom York took over AMF, the company was beginning to flounder, and Tom York was an AMF man through and through. He was not a motorcyclist. For decades, AMF had a dual-focus business model, industrial on one side with leisure on the other. Thus, AMF companies made tennis rackets and sailing dinghies on the leisure side, and missile launching systems and nuclear reactors on their industrial side. By the end of the 1970s, AMF was a lumbering monster unable to efficiently manage such a wildly diverse product portfolio. According to Greg Field in the Complete Harley History, Vaughan Beals said that in mid-1980, York hired a planning firm who convinced him that AMF should be half industrial and half leisure. At the time, AMF was about 2/3 leisure. York's strategy to redress the perceived imbalance was to purchase yet more companies to bolster the industrial side of the business. This failed, costing all of AMF's available funds, leaving nothing for Harley-Davidson. Market conditions worsened for Harley to such a degree that by 1982 production halved from the previous year to 24,000 bikes, and it was forced to lay off 40% of its workforce and reduce wages for everyone else. Unsurprisingly then, with no investment available, little changed for the Sportster. The XLS Roadster had been introduced for 1979, aiming to profit on the success from its largest stablemate, the FXS Lowrider. That same year marked the end for the fabled XLCH, so the Sportster line dwindled to just two models, the XLH1000 and the XLS1000 Roadster. Sportster sales were about 11,650 for 1979, split fairly evenly between the XLH and the XLS. In 1980, sales for the XLH hit 11,800, but XLS sales plummeted to under 3,000. There were several minor updates for 1980, including fully electronic ignition, which was used on all models, including the FX Cruisers and the FL Tourers.
In 1979, 1 year over only, they went to this little thing. This goes down where that plate does. It takes these same horrible flyweights that bang into the back of the plate, break off, snap, cause all of that. And then instead of that lumpy cam, it's got this sharp, right? Because that dials in with the sensor, right? The module, the electronics are in the cone, like these aftermarket ones we're going to talk about. That's not good because it gets hot. So it's got electronics here. The electronics aren't sophisticated enough to do advance and retard. They let the old stupid flyweights do that in 1979. So this is that 79 torn apart. I've never been able to read what it is. And then here's the power transistor instead of the points. So all that being in the module, it can work, but good luck. We finally get, I think it would be 1980, the modern thing, which is this little cone. And see, there's no electronics here, there's just this sensor. This is magnetic, so it's Hall effect. Some of the aftermarket stuff used optical. I think it's just more robust. But then this is all that's in your cone.
A new hugger option was added for the Sportster, which offered lower suspension and seat height. For 1981, even fewer changes were applied, although a 1.8 gallon and a 2.7 gallon petrol tank were offered as options for both the XLH and the XLS models. For the first time, dual throttle cables equipped the Sportsters, providing separate cables for opening and closing the throttle. Donnie Peterson tells me that these are properly called throttle and idle cables respectively. Sportster sales fell to under 11,000 this year, but the XLS suffered most with only 1,660 bikes being sold. A limited Milwaukee edition XLH was also offered for 1981. Sportsterpedia says reportedly only 804 of these motorcycles were produced, one for every Harley dealership and one extra for the top 100 dealers. 4 more were produced for promotional purposes. Since Tom York was failing in his aim to generate the correct beans in the correct patterns, another approach was required. Alas, bean counters lack or repress any creative urge or imaginative process, as these things just don't exhibit beans to count. This in fact leaves all bean counters crucially vulnerable at precisely the point at which they believe themselves to be at their strongest. York was faced with the classic bean counter problem. He couldn't get his numbers to add up. What was required was a genuine virtuoso to fix the problem, someone who could speak bean counter, but who had the creative ability, the strength of character, the raw intelligence, and the visionary spirit. This man was the legendary Harley-Davidson saviour, Vaughan Beals. AMF CEO Tom York had been raising Harley-Davidson higher and higher up the proverbial wall until 1981, when the entire company had reached the top shelf. This wasn't just a single heavy motorcycle with its many thousands of joules of stored up potential energy. This was an entire motorcycle producing company. With such a massive establishment, including vast manufacturing and international distribution and sales outlets, raised so precariously high, the potential energy stored here was unimaginable. But if Vaughan Beals was going to release that energy, how would he do it? The store of beans we're talking about here is not joules worth of energy, it's simply money. For Tom York, Harley-Davidson represented beans, nothing more. By 1980, Harley were generating about 20% of all the beans that AMF produced out of 40-odd companies. With AMF floundering, York needed more beans, and he needed half to be generated by the leisure side and half by the industrial side. By starving Harley of investment, he was saving beans for AMF, overtly his top priority, and effectively hanging Harley out to dry up high on the shelf. His hope was, presumably, that the huge potential financial energy that the motor company's position offered would save AMF. Vaughan Beals was very pessimistic about this. "I knew we were going to die and take AMF with us," he said. His solution exercised all his numerous talents and abilities. Beals knew that a feeble, narrow-minded bean counter can be manipulated. It's easy to get a bean counter to do anything you want. All you need are the right numbers. Vaughan Beals worked out a simple way for York to get the beans he wanted and in the patterns he was told he needed. Beals told York AMF could get the 50-50 objective easier if it sold Harley-Davidson. For York, this must have been all his Christmases at once. Suddenly his beans could all be there and in the correct order. Bean-topia. For Vaughan Beals and the Harley management, though, this meant they were entering the most difficult time in the history of the Harley-Davidson Motor Company. But on the 16th of June 1981, the deal was done. The management team had to find $1 million as equity and secure loans for $71 million, which Vaughan Beals says was about a quarter of the Harley-Davidson value at the time.